Hey historians, it's time to look at the explosive bits. That's right, let's look at the early conflicts in American history, and I bet you don't know them all. Let's take a look. Now, you rarely ever hear about the conflicts that arise between the American Revolution and the War of 1812. See, it turns out that the United States of America, the fledgling baby United States of America, is actually going to be rebelled against by the American people, not once, but twice, to varying degrees of seriousness. The first and most serious was called Shay's Rebellion, and it arose in Massachusetts, which is exactly where the American Revolution arose. Makes you wonder about Massachusetts a little bit. It happened in 1786 and 1787, and it's going to inspire the United States of America to actually throw away the Articles of Confederation, their first government, and form the Constitution, the government we still work under. And it's because Shay's Rebellion points out the deficiencies of having a weak central government, which is exactly what the Articles of Confederation had set up. This guy, Daniel Shay, was a former Revolutionary War soldier. And like a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers, he spent most of the time between 1775 and 1783 in the Continental Army, which meant he didn't spend those years on his farm making money, which meant he didn't have money to pay the state of Massachusetts, which suddenly decided to raise taxes on land. There was a rash of land seizures and bankruptcies and foreclosures. And a lot of times the people getting left out in the cold were former soldiers. And they didn't feel this was right. After all, they had been fighting for the American cause. So what happens? Under the leadership of Daniel Shay, they organize and they actually march on the United States Armory at Springfield. It's an unsuccessful march. There's blood that is shed. The rebellion is put down. But this is the act that actually inspires people to come together and go, you know, if we had had a strong national government instead of a weak one, Shay's Rebellion either wouldn't have happened or would have been put down far earlier. Less serious was the Whiskey Rebellion, which happens in 1794. It comes after George Washington is elected president for the first time. So we have our new Constitution and we have our first president. Yay, Gentleman George! One of the first things the new government does is raises a tax on whiskey. They raise a tax to try to pay back some of that debt that the states had accrued during the American Revolution. And so, like the British before them, they have to raise taxes. Only this time it's taxation with representation. The representatives of the United States voted for the tax, and here it is. Well, the Whiskey Rebellion, that result is proof that Americans didn't really like taxation with representation either. The farmers in western Pennsylvania had always been used to making, distilling and making whiskey and selling it on the side and making a nice profit. It was part of their lives. Now they're having to take part of that profit and give it to the government, which means they're making less money. So they decided to rebel. Now, George Washington wasn't having any of this. He asked for peace, but he also raised a 13,000-man army and rode out in his old uniform at the head of that army itself. You really don't see presidents doing this now. They don't put on a uniform and go out at the head of the army. Well, George Washington was like, I think so. This is going to happen. Well, the Whiskey Rebellion doesn't wind up with any fighting because mostly they're cowed by the idea that George Washington, this figure that Americans kind of looked up to. Here's George Washington riding in going, yeah, Scooter, you're going to want to back down. And so they do back down. And the concept that, hey, if the representative government decides to do something, then, hey, your only recourse is to not elect those representatives next time. Rebellion is not an option. One of the last little conflicts before the War of 1812 that rarely ever gets mentioned wasn't really a war, even though there was conflict. It involved the United States and France. And if you're sitting there going, wait, whoa, hold on. Didn't France just help us win the American Revolution? Yes and no. France did lend troops and money and their navy to the American Revolution, yes. But that's not the same France that America is going to fight in the Quasi-War from 1798 to 1800. The Quasi-War arises because the French government is overthrown. The French king is overthrown. The French people, kind of inspired by the American example, overthrow their king, and now there's a French republic. Well, turns out we weren't really that fond of the French Republic. We kind of patched up our differences with Great Britain, who also wasn't fond of the French Republic, and we were like, yeah, you know, all that money that we said we'd repay you, well, we said we'd repay the French king, not the French Republic. This is a whole different government, so we're not going to pay that back. So, what is the Quasi-War? We never actually land troops and fight against each other on the land, but it erupts mainly at sea. The French ships will stop American ships and seize our shipping. We'll send ships back and we'll try to seize French shipping. It goes back and forth. There's even something that's just kind of crazy called the XYZ affair, where the French actually say, hey, you know, if you pay us some money, we'll actually go ahead and make this war disappear. They demand a bribe of President John Adams. They're like, hey, pay us a bribe and we're going to normalize relations and this is all going to disappear. So that's the Quasi-War. It actually disappears when the French government changes yet again and Napoleon Bonaparte becomes the first consul of France, and he's later going to go on to become the Emperor of France. But that's the Quasi-War. It's the war that almost happened and then didn't because France kept changing back and forth like just craziness. The next conflict we run into in early American history is the War of 1812. And pretty much what most students can remember or recall about the War of 1812 is that it happened in 1812. It's kind of America's forgotten war. It actually lasts from 1812 to 1814, but here's the kicker. The reason we actually go to war is no longer a reason by the time the war starts. This is the American Revolution Part 2. The War of 1812 starts primarily because Britain was being a little bit of a bully to the new kid on the block, the United States of America. It was being a little bit of a bully by impressing U.S. sailors. That means going to U.S. ships, stopping them, taking American citizens, American sailors, and going, you are part of the British Navy now. Do I get a choice? I'm an American, you know, individual rights and liberties. No! No, you don't get a choice. You're part of the British Navy now. Hop on board. It's going to be about 7 or 8 years. You're going to live in this little wooden ship over here and eat biscuit and get scurvy and your teeth are going to fall out and probably going to get whipped if you talk back to the captain and, you know, yeah, fun times. Join the Navy. And also to stir the pot, the British were talking to the Native Americans in North America and kind of insinuating that the more they killed as far as American settlers go, the better the British would like. And also, there's this growing nationalism in the United States. We were actually finally starting to go, you know, hey, you know what? We're a country. We're not like a collection of states. We're a country, man. Yeah, we can beat anybody. Bring it on. We're Americans. And so we start the War of 1812. Now, the funny thing about the war is, by the time it starts, Britain has agreed to stop impressing American sailors and lift the trade restrictions on France, but of course, the message that Britain has stopped doing that crosses the ocean, and our declaration of war crosses the ocean, and they just cross each other. So by the time we start the war, our reasons for starting it are basically over. But it doesn't stop us from fighting for the next 2 years. Now, the problem with the War of 1812 is we weren't really good at it. For the first year and a half, we basically wind up getting beat a lot. In fact, we invade Canada, and that doesn't work out too well for us. And then the British invade, and they actually get to Washington, D.C. and burn it to the ground. Okay, that's no good. In fact, the only bright spot we get from the War of 1812 is after the invasion, after the burning of Washington, we do start to fight back with increasing amount of efficiency. Thankfully, we throw the British back at Baltimore, which is where we get the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key is watching the British shell Fort McHenry in Baltimore, and Fort McHenry does not fall, even though it's being bombarded. And he sees the flag still waving, and he's like, hey, cool on, America. All right, I'm going to write a song about that. And then, 200 years from now, people are going to be like standing up and singing it at baseball games. So, I mean, after this invasion of the United States and the burning of Washington, we really start to pull it together, especially in the South, where Andrew Jackson has actually been winding up the Indian problem by defeating the Creeks and the Seminoles in the South, and then he turns around and he defeats a British army in this very famous battle called the Battle of New Orleans, where he defeats a much larger British army. But this being the War of 1812, the war has actually been over for 2 weeks before this battle even happens. And yes, you guessed it, the news of the treaty was crossing the ocean before, bam, the battle happens over here. So the news of the treaty is still coming this way. Battle here, news of the treaty gets there, it's like, ooh, whoops. The War of 1812 basically solidifies, hey, we're a nation, we can handle it, we can stand up amidst the community of nations and hold our own.